Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear respected brothers and sisters. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What if I told you that one of the very repeated stories about Iran today by one of the Sunni scholars is not completely false, but carefully incomplete and distorted? And that this incompleteness is exactly what makes it dangerous. Because when a few key truths are left out, when facts are arranged in a selective order, and when the speaker delivers the result with enough confidence, a weak argument can begin to sound like serious history. That is exactly the problem here. In his lecture on the history of Iran, Dr. Yasir Qadhi presents a narrative that at first glance sounds calm, academic, and balanced. He repeatedly gives the impression that he is simply describing historical developments, that he is not approaching the issue through a sectarian feeling, and that he has no interest in making this a Sunni Shi'i argument. But when one listens carefully to his lecture, a different pattern appears beneath the language of neutrality. Again and again, the structure of the lecture leads to one conclusion. Iran flourished when it was Sunni. Shiism later spread largely through Safavid power, and many of Iran's present-day struggles can somehow be linked to that religious transformation. This is where one must stop, because some of the individual details he mentions are not entirely wrong. The problem is not that he mentions facts. The problem is that he arranges those facts into a sectarian storyline and then presents that storyline as though it were neutral, mere neutral analysis. In other words, he keeps saying, in effect, I'm not looking at this through a sectarian lens, while the entire architecture of his argument keeps dragging him back into exactly that lens. Whether unconsciously or with subtle rhetorical skill, he turns the subject into a sectarian one after insisting that he is doing no such thing. And this is precisely where the argument begins to fail, because this is not careful history. It is selective framing. And selective framing, no matter how calmly delivered, is still selective. Now, to understand Iran properly, we must begin from a deeper and more serious point. Iran did not begin with the Safavids, and it did not begin with sectarian categories. Long before Islam, Iran was already one of the great civilizations of the world. Under the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated political orders of the ancient world emerged. Under the Sasanian Empire, Iran developed advanced systems of administration, law, political order, urban organization, high culture, and intellectual life. Places such as Persepolis and Ctesiphon were not merely monuments of political domination. They were signs of an old and deeply rooted civilization, that one that valued discipline, statecraft, knowledge, beauty, and memory. This matters because it shows that Iran was never a blank page waiting for identity. But it would be equally shallow to stop there and pretend that Islam added nothing decisive. Islam did not erase Iran. Islam elevated Iran, reoriented Iran, and opened it to a universal moral and spiritual horizon. It brought revelation, a deeper grammar of ethics, and a broader mission of knowledge and justice. So the truth is not that Iran owes everything to its pre-Islamic greatness, and it is certainly not that Iran's greatness came merely from being part of a Sunni order. The truth is far deeper than both of those claims. Iran's civilization and the civilizational flowering came from the meeting of an ancient civilization with the life-giving force of Islam. And here we reach one of the first major weaknesses in Yasir Qadhi's narrative. He seems to reduce that Islamic contribution to a Sunni frame, as if Islam, in its richest and most authentic civilizational form can be equated with Sunni political history. That's it. But this is a serious mistake and distortion because Islam is not exhausted by one sectarian reading. That's it. And no honest account of Islamic history can marginalize the Ahl al-Bayt, namely the progeny of the Prophet Muhammad. The family of the Prophet is not a decorative addition to Islamic memory. Their spiritual, ethical, and intellectual role is central. Whoever treats the teachings of the Ahl al-Bayt as secondary is not merely neglecting Shiism. He's actually neglecting one of the deepest and most authentic streams of Islam itself. This is especially important in the case of Iran because the Iranian relationship with the progeny of the Prophet is not theoretical. It is historical, emotional, spiritual, and civilizational. The migration of members and descendants of the Prophet's household into Iranian lands was not incidental. It mattered profoundly. The presence of Imam Raza alayhi salam's shrine in Mashhad was not, and he himself was not a small historical detail. It transformed the spiritual map of Iran. His shrine became a center not only of pilgrimage, but of learning, memory, identity, and civilizational continuity. Qom too emerged very early as one of the great centers of Shiri scholarship. Long before the Safavid state, northern regions such as Tabaristan and Daylam had already witnessed Alevid movements and Shia influence. All of this matters because it completely weakens the simplistic claim that Iran became Shi'i merely because one ruler imposed it from above. Yet, this is precisely the kind of simplification the lecture leads on and leans on. When Yasir Qadhi suggests that Iran became Shia mainly because of Shah Ismail Safawi, he is not offering a bold historical insight. He is offering a historically thin shortcut. The Safavids did not create Shiism out of nothing. They formalized it. They gave it state structure, institutional support, and political visibility. Yes, some level of pressure existed in that process as it has existed in the formation of many states across history. But to reduce the entire transformation to coercion is historically careless. And here the decisive question must be asked. And it is that if Shiism had only been imposed by force, why did it endure? How? Why did it survive the fall of dynasties? Why did it become embedded in Persian poetry and mourning rituals, sacred memory, literature, language, and moral imagination? Why did it move from the court to the street, from policy to culture, from power to conviction? The answer is obvious. Because it resonated. Yes, resonated. Because it answered something real in the Iranian soul. Iran was never merely a land of outward conformity. It was a civilization that valued wisdom, beauty, ethics, and reflection. A people shaped by such a history do not remain satisfied with shallow religion forever. They search, they compare, they test claims. They look beneath appearances. And in the teachings of the Ahl al-Bayt, many Iranians found what they were looking for: justice without compromise, knowledge without distortion, spirituality without hypocrisy, and authority without servility to empire. This is why Shiism did not remain a government policy. It became a culture. It entered poetry, ritual language, sacred space, collective memory, and social imagination. It became part of how many people understood loyalty, suffering, dignity, resistance, and truth. So yes, the state played a role in formalizing it, but what sustained Shiism in Iran was not force alone. It was conviction, recognition, and love. It was accepted because it was experienced as true. Another major weakness in the lecture lies in its handling of intellectual history. There is an attempt, sometimes direct, sometimes subtle, to claim the great scholars and literary figures of Iran and the wider Islamic world as though their intellectual legacy belongs neatly to one sect. But reality is far more interconnected than that. Figures such as Ferdowsi and Hafiz cannot be imprisoned inside rigid sectarian boxes. Their works breathe reverence, depth, moral seriousness, symbolism, spirituality, and a civilizational sensibility profoundly open to the family of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Even within classical Sunni traditions, the influence of the Ahl al-Bayt is too obvious to ignore. Abu Hanifa, for example, that Imam of the Sunnis, studied, yes, Abu Hanifa studied under Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, the sixth Imam of the Shia. Jalal ad-Din al-Suyuti and Zamakhshari, as Qadhi mentions in his lecture, showed admiration and deep engagement with the family of the Prophet. This demonstrates a simple truth. Islamic intellectual history was never a neatly sealed arrangement of hostile sectarian compartments. It was an intertwined civilizational network. To flatten that complexity into a sectarian ownership claim is not scholarship, it is reduction. And reduction, repeated often enough, is still reduction. Then we come to the central logical problem in the lecture. What's that? What do you think? And this is where the argument becomes startlingly weak. Its structure is simple. Iran was successful when it was Sunni. Yeah, this is a claim Yasir Qadhi mentions. Iran faces serious challenges now while it is Shia. Therefore, Sunni identity caused success and Shia identity caused decline. This is not a serious historical argument, not a serious one. It is a classic false cause fallacy. It confuses sequence with causation. Did you get that? It confuses sequence with causation, but they're different. It ignores pre-Islamic civilizational capital, imperial structures, colonial intervention, modern geopolitics, economic warfare and sanctions, regional conflicts, and internal governance complexity. To ignore all of that and then place the burden on theology is not absolutely analysis. It is convenience. And if you're being honest, it is a surprisingly weak level of reasoning for someone trying to sound historically sophisticated. One hears the confidence in the lecture, but confidence is not proof. Is that? Tone is not method. Delivery is not evidence. A claim does not become strong simply because it is repeated with calm certainty and beyond the labels of being a doctor, of being a celebrity, of being a famous and a popular person among your community. There's also a broader historical problem that the lecture handles with striking selectivity. If coercion is to be made a central moral criticism, then one must speak consistently. The intertwining of religion and power is not unique to Shiism. Across history, rulers, empires, and states have shaped religious life, promoted particular interpretations, and used authority to organize law and belief. In the Christian world, for example, the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition stand as obvious reminders that religion has often moved alongside power and violence and coercive enforcement. In modern political contexts tied to Jewish identity, especially in Palestine, for example, right now, critics point out how religious narratives and state force can intervene in devastating ways. This doesn't mean that what the Zionist regime is doing right now in the land of Palestine is something right in terms of religiosity. Absolutely wrong. But in the broader context, we know that religion is intertwined with politics. We cannot dismantle politics or dismantle religiosity and separate them from each other. Within the context of Islam, the context of Quran, the context of the words of the progeny of the Ahl al-Bayt and the traditions of the Prophet and Imams, they are totally intertwined. A larger scale of the propositions in Islam and orders and rituals are social, are political, related to the betterment of the affairs of the people inside the society. In Islamic history, early expansion into Persia took place through political and military structures. Later Sunni empires, for example, especially the Ottoman Empire, exercised strong control over doctrine and public religion. The record cannot honestly be narrated as though it were untouched by coercive state power, nor can one ignore rigid theological trends. Interpretations associated with Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, were later taken up by some movements in harsh and exclusionary ways. One does not need to claim that every later abuse is identical with the original thinker to recognize a plain historical truth. Certain strands of rigidity became highly influential. In the modern period, extremist groups such as ISIS drew on such hardline frames to justify takfir, terror, and brutality. Of course, they do not represent the majority of Sunnis, and no fair person should say otherwise. But their existence is enough to expose the weakness of any narrative that tries to present coercion, harshness, and political religion as though they were somehow unique to Shiism. So why isolate Safavid to Iran? Why highlight one case and mute the others? Because once you include the wider pattern, the sectarian storyline begins to break apart. And that is exactly the problem for the lecture. A full history complicates the conclusion. A selective history protects it. At this point, another major issue must be confronted. What distinguishes the school of the Ahl al-Bayt is not that it has no history with power, but that its deepest moral core is not empire. What is it then? It is resistance. From Karbala onward, the heart of this tradition has been clear. It is to stand against oppression, even if you stand alone and even if it costs everything in your life. That is why the present matters. Because when we turn from the past to the modern world, the original claim becomes even more fragile. If one wishes to judge traditions by their fruits, then the contemporary role of Iran cannot simply be ignored. In recent decades, Iran has positioned itself as standing against domination, extremism, occupation, and global pressure in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, Yemen, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in everywhere else. Forces aligned with Iran played direct roles in fighting ISIS. In Lebanon, for example, the resistance front reshaped deterrence. In Palestine, Iran's support for resistance made it central to one of the greatest moral questions of our age, an issue that has become the conscience of much of the world. In Yemen, the regional map again reveals that Iran is not a passive observer, but part of a larger resistance-oriented vision. This has come at great cost. Lives lost, resources spent, pressure sustained, enemies multiplied. And yet, the claim remains that Shiism produced only weakness. But what do we actually see? What we see is resilience. What we see is influence. What we see is a state and a society that whatever one thinks of every policy, chose confrontation with powerful enemies instead of comfortable submission. That is not weakness. That is not decline in any simple sense. And many supporters of this path explicitly root it in the teachings of the al-Bayt. Justice over comfort, resistance over surrender, truth over compromise. This is why the claim that Shiism produced only failure collapses under the weight of reality. A tradition that sustains sacrifice, endurance, and resistance cannot be dismissed as a mere political imposition. If it were superficial, it would not inspire martyrdom. If it were empty, it would not produce steadfastness. If it were only the artifact of a dynasty, it would not shape the strategic and moral imagination of a people centuries later. Even from outside Iran, major analysts have recognized its weight. John Mearsheimer, for example, has described Iran as a major regional power. Alexander Younger, the boss at the MI6, ex-principal of MI6, has pointed to Iran's strategic resilience and ability to maintain the upper hand in conflict. These are not devotional statements, absolutely. They are recognitions of reality from outside the Shia world, and they matter because they expose the weakness of declension narratives that try to present Iran's Shia era as only a story of decay. One further point should not be ignored either. The timing of this lecture matters. Yasir Qadhi, when? 1 week after the unrests in Iran. To deliver such a sectarianized reading of Iran shortly after the unrest and terrorist disturbances of 18 and 19 day 1404 Persian date, corresponding to January 8 and 9, 2026, while international media spaces, especially in the United States, were overflowing with emotionally charged claims and fake ones, inflated numbers, and politically loaded narratives, raises serious ethical and intellectual questions. It is entirely possible that Yasir Qadhi was influenced by that atmosphere, by the American media environment, by the ease with which confident but unverified stories circulate there. Or perhaps the timing reflects another motive, that at a moment when Iran's regional role support for Palestine and visibility in the eyes of the world had grown, he felt the need, consciously or unconsciously, to cut Iran down to size through historical reframing. But truth does not disappear because propaganda is loud. And the services Iran has rendered to the resistance front, to the Palestinian cause, to confronting extremism, and to standing against domination cannot simply be edited out of history because they are inconvenient for a sectarian storyline. A scholar should be more careful than that. A scholar should be slower than that. A scholar should not take the noise of the moment and turn it into a civilizational verdict, because once that happens, history stops being history and becomes performance. And that is exactly what must be resisted. So in the end, the issue is not whether Iran was once Sunni or is now Shia. The real issue is whether history can be explained by a simplistic sectarian formula or not. Of course, it cannot. Iran's story is the story of an ancient civilization, a transformative encounter with Islam, a deep bond with the al-Bayt, a gradual and enduring religious internalization, and a modern political role shaped by resistance. Any narrative that reduces all of this to one sectarian explanation is not deep history. It is shallow arrangement. It is not careful scholarship. It is a confident story built on selective emphasis, and selective emphasis, no matter how elegantly delivered, is still not the truth. Because truth is not found in the easiest story, truth is found in the fuller one. And once you see the fuller picture, the arrangement and the argument changes completely. What looked at first like scholarship begins to look like something else, a polished simplification, a neat sectarian look and storyline, a weak argument dressed in historical language. And that is why it must be answered. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.